Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next in our fall speaker series here at the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton University. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the room with us this evening. It's wonderful to see all of you, and a welcome also to our alumni, parents, and friends joining us this evening via Zoom. I hope you enjoy this evening's presentation. For those of you who don't yet know me, my name is Marcus Gibson, and I'm delighted to direct the Aquinas Institute's academic programming and initiatives. And I'm thrilled this evening to be able to share with you a lecture on the teachings, writings, the thought of St. Augustine of Hippo. In the year of a papal election, when an Augustinian pope is elected, it's maybe an especially opportune time to be revisiting or maybe discovering for the first time the writings of this great saint and theologian and philosopher, doctor of the church. And so I'm especially excited to be able to introduce to you this evening to share with us on the subject of Augustine's thought, Professor Sarah Byers. Professor Byers is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Boston College. Her master's and Ph.D. are from the University of Toronto, and she's a scholar of ancient and medieval philosophy. Her first monograph is titled Perception, Sensibility, and Moral Motivation in Augustine, a Stoic Platonic Synthesis. And she's the author of numerous articles in ancient and medieval philosophy as well. This year, she is here on campus at Princeton as a visiting fellow of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, where she is working on a second monograph, which is concerned with the roots of medieval natural law theory, in which Professor Byers argues that recent interpretive debates on natural law can only be resolved through familiarity with the Greek texts of Hellenistic philosophy and with their reception by the Christian Alexandrian tradition and later Carolingian Greek and Latin sources. So, here to speak with us this evening on the question, why read St. Augustine, please join me in welcoming Professor Sarah Byers.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I'm very thrilled to be here. And the main reason to read Augustine is the exceptional content of his thought, right? So if you've ever read him, he's just a brilliant, brilliant thinker. And that's why I thought the best way to try to persuade you to read some Augustine is not so much to talk about him as a person, but to talk about his ideas and his theories. And usually what Augustine is trying to do is take some problem or question that is unresolved from ancient philosophy and to try to answer it using additional resources from the Christian tradition, the Christian Bible, but also later ancient philosophy. So what we call Middle Platonism and Roman Stoicism, Stoicism of the Roman period. So I'd just like to illustrate this for you by looking at three of the most important theories that he articulates. So I did start off with a little bit of personal information about him. So I understand that you're reading Augustine's Confessions this semester, some of you, so some of you already know this basic outline of his life. But I will just highlight some of the interesting things, I think, for a contemporary audience. So if we look at age 16 to 19, he goes to Carthage. Basically, he goes away to college, right? If we try to compare this to our situation today. It's like moving away from home, going away to college, and he starts to cohabitate with his girlfriend, right? And so that's in itself, I think, sort of worth noting because looking back on him, we think of him as this exceptional saint, this role model of Catholicism, but if you look at his life, it's obviously not all exemplary from that point of view, right? And again, if we look at what happens to him in his career, we can just see a series of problems. So he moves from Tagaste to Carthage, and then from Carthage to Rome, and then from Rome to Milan. And the impetus each time is some sort of difficulty or problem with his job, right? So this again is interesting, and I'm going to mention in the next slide here why I think it's interesting. What it tells us about the way that Augustine experienced providence. And when you read the Confessions, especially in book 5 of the Confessions, you really see him sort of emphasizing these themes. One thing is that he experienced providence as a kind of violent force in his life. So a lot of times we think of God as God loves us and God's providence is so beneficial for us, which is true, but Augustine has also this view of God as sort of exhibiting tough love towards us, right? So he talks about being moved by God from one place to another in an almost violent fashion by means of catastrophes and suffering. Then he's moved off of his professional path by an illness of the chest and a strong grace which converts him to Christianity. And then eventually he's made a priest contrary to his plans. So if you read Posidius's biography of Augustine, Posidius was one of the clerics in Augustine's set of canons at the cathedral in Hippo that he established after he became a bishop. And Posidius describes that when Augustine was ordained a priest, he was actually crying because the way that the ordination happened, it was called ordination by acclamation, which was a method of ordination in the early church where if there was a need for priests in a certain area and a young man was attending at Mass, the bishop in the homily could just name the young man and say, put him on the spot and say, we really need priests, and what are you doing for the church? You're not helping us enough. And the people would acclaim, they would clap and show their support for this young man. And on the spot, he would have to say yes or no. And that's actually how Augustine ended up being ordained. He had been avoiding certain dioceses and certain churches because he knew there was a priest shortage in certain places. And he wanted to live an ascetical, philosophical life of leisure with his friends. A wealthy patron was paying for them. But in any event, this is just one example of how providence operates in his life, he thinks. Eventually, he becomes important and influential and sort of changes the history of Western civilization by becoming a priest and then a bishop, right? But initially, it was contrary to what he thought he wanted. The second point is God can bring good out of evil. So when you read Augustine in his sermons, sometimes he compares creation to the operation of providence. So in creation, God brings something from nothing. And in God's divine omnipotence, operating through providence, he can bring good things out of evil things. So there are examples, again, from Augustine's life, where it seems like something terrible is happening to him, but it ends up being good for him in terms of his moral development and in terms of his salvation. And the third interesting point is what we sometimes call divine irony. If you read like spiritual reading books, they will talk about the concept of divine irony, almost like God has a sense of humor, right? So when you read the Confessions, the way that he got his position in Milan, which was his major career break, it was an endowed imperial chair of rhetoric in the imperial city of Milan. And the way that he got it was through Manichaean connections. But by moving to Milan and encountering Ambrose, he broke away from Manichaeism, ultimately, right? Because he encountered an alternate, intellectually more satisfying account of Jesus Christ and God and salvation. Okay, so I do have a few pictures here just to show you remnants of buildings that Augustine would have used. So these are the grounds, the remains of the Roman library in Carthage. So we can imagine Augustine going here to use codices, early books, right, scrolls. This is just an example of Roman engineering. I was impressed by their gutter system. And this is still the library, but it shows you the beautiful view because it's on top of a hill right next to the ocean. And then this is the theater that he actually talks about in Book 2 of Confessions when he says he's addicted to going to the theater. He's an aesthete, and he enjoys the emotional roller coaster of identifying with the characters and the catharsis. And this is the actual theater, still exists. It's partially reconstructed. That's why the seats look so neat and chiseled. But the parts underneath, you can see kind of the rougher parts. That's the original material. they actually still use this. As you can see, they were setting up for a summer concert there, and that's the stage from, the Roman period. Also in the Confessions, he describes how he dumped his mother when he moved from Carthage to Rome, and he said, "Oh yeah, Mom, we're leaving in the morning on the boat." And she said, "Okay, great, I'm going to stay and pray in this church tonight. I'll meet you in the morning at the shore." And in the meantime, he left without her and left her on the shore. And these are some of the pillars from the church that have been recovered from this site. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the theory, the three different theories. First of all, I think it's important that he has a very sophisticated interpretation of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis that is generally compatible with contemporary theoretical physics and some evolutionary theory. Secondly, he has a sophisticated account of emotions that anticipates successful contemporary cognitive therapies. And thirdly, he has a sophisticated account of how bad habits and addictions can be overcome by grace, and of how grace works with the cooperation of human free will. So this final point was heavily debated in the modern period. There's a famous controversy after the Protestant Reformation called the De Auxiliis controversy. The controversy about divine aid is how we would say it in English. And so it's kind of important because it's considered an unresolved debate in the church. There was never a doctrinal statement made by the church, even though there were public debates between Dominicans and Jesuits about the question of the relationship between grace and free choice. At the end, the Pope just said, "Stop arguing publicly about it, and I'm not going to make a pronouncement." So I think that Augustine actually has a very interesting theory that I recovered through using Stoic epistemology and recognizing how he was using Stoic epistemology. And that allows us to say, which side of that debate has the more Augustinian position, the Jesuits or the Dominicans. So I will get to that at the end. So let's begin with chapter 1 of Genesis. This is taken from a book that he wrote called The Literal Meaning of Genesis. He wrote 3 different books about Genesis, okay? So this is the most important one. And if you're ever looking for this book, you can find a volume published by New City Press. It's called Augustine on Genesis. But then when you get inside that book, you have to make sure you've got the right text, because there are 3 different texts. Okay. So the literal meaning of Genesis. What is his hermeneutical theory? In other words, his interpretative theory. He thinks that the Bible contains no mistakes because the primary author of the text is God. He thinks that what the Bible says cannot contradict what we know about the world from science because God created the world that we know through science. I just want to flag quickly that point A does not mean that he thinks that everything in the Bible is doctrinal. Okay, so that's a different point. Some of the things in the Bible are circumstantially conditioned, historically relevant statements that are made, but they're not all equally absolute for all times and places. Also, the different books of the Bible don't all have the same weight, according to Augustine. So the Gospels have more weight than the letters of Paul, for example, because Paul is not Christ. Okay. Anyway, that's an aside. The third important point is that the style of a biblical text tells us its sense. So he thinks there's a historical sense, an allegorical sense, a moral sense, and an eschatological sense. And we can tell which one is intended in a book of the Bible or a passage of the Bible by looking at the style. So if you've ever read the Song of Songs, if you've attended a wedding and heard it read out, it's poetry, right? So this tells us that the sense is allegorical. The book of Kings, if you've ever picked that up and tried to read it, it's almost boring in certain places, right? Because it just says so-and-so got up and put on her dress and she walked into town and she bought a loaf of bread. And so it's like reading the newspaper. It's just a report of things that happen. So the style tells us that it's a historical sense. It's trying to convey to us events that happened. Okay. All right, so now the key point about Genesis is when you read chapter 1, it says this happened, that happened, the other thing happened. So the style is like she got up, put on her dress, went to the market, and bought some bread. Okay, so it's supposed to be a historical book, Augustine thinks. So just a review of the days. in the Bible. So we have day 1 is the creation of light, day 2, creation of the quote-unquote firmament, which means atmosphere or sky. Day 3, bodies of water and land, plants and trees. 4th day, the sun, the moon, and additional stars. The 5th day, all sea animals and birds. And the 6th day, all terrestrial animals and human beings. So immediately, Augustine, in this book, The Literal Meaning of Genesis, which means the historical meaning of Genesis. Okay, when you see the word literal for Augustine, he's talking about the historical sense. Genesis speaks of light, morning, and evening prior to the creation of the sun, right? Because we just saw that the sun is on the 4th day. So we have an immediate problem of what on earth the text could be talking about. Morning, evening, and day typically refer to 24-hour periods marked by the Earth's reception of light coming from the sun. So, it seems like a blatant contradiction in the text. Now I have to say, this is not Augustine's original insight. If you look at what the ancient rabbis say about the book of Genesis, they also raise this problem. All right, so there's a text called Genesis Rabbah, which is a compilation of what the ancient rabbis have said about how to interpret various lines of the Bible. It was compiled in the 4th century, and it also raises this problem. Okay, so Augustine thinks that the best solution to the question is to look for another possible meaning of the word light besides physical light. We say that someone is enlightened or has seen the light, or that some truth has dawned on someone. So light can mean understanding. So when the text says that God created light, it could mean that God created intellectual light. That is, God created minds that were understanding. Now keep in mind, he thinks this is a literal meaning, because it's still about historical events. Okay, so literal does not mean, if you go like to the southern United States and you talk to Baptists about the Bible, right, when they say the literal meaning of the Bible, this is obviously different, right? Because this is what we would call a metaphor. But for Augustine, the word ad literam, literal, it means historical. So he thinks this chapter is telling us God did something. It was an event that happened in time, but God was not creating physical light. He was creating a different kind of light. Okay, so it's still about history, but the word light is metaphorical. Now we have another issue, which is that human beings are said to be created on day 6, and we're still trying to explain day 1 with the creation of light. Okay, so the created minds were not human minds. So they must have been creatures who were intellects, but not humans. So the text, obviously, must be referring to angels, which are by definition created intelligences. So the creation of light was the creation of angels. So now we have the problem, what do morning and evening and day mean? They have to be consistent with this meaning of light. When we're talking about physical light, morning and evening refer to periods where there's more or less light, obviously. So if light refers to the understanding of the angels, who are intellects, then morning means a superior kind of understanding, a more intense light, while evening means an inferior kind of understanding, or a less brilliant light. And then day is going to be these two kinds of understanding combined or taken as one. So then he spells out what he thinks this inferior and superior kind of knowledge would be. Morning knowledge is the angels contemplating the divine ideas in the mind of God, or the Word of God. Evening knowledge is the angels' knowledge of creatures already created and existing in their own right apart from God. So for example, you can know a mulberry tree in the sense that you know its transcendent form or pattern, which subsists in God's mind as an idea, or you can know an actual created mulberry tree, the one outside the window, let's say. The angels have knowledge on both levels of reality. They have morning and evening knowledge. Knowing the pattern that subsists in God is a superior type of knowledge, because if you understand the pattern, you understand the essence and can recognize any individual particular mulberry tree as a mulberry tree. Whereas if you know one particular mulberry tree, the one outside the window, you only know that one limited particular example. It doesn't allow you to recognize any member of the set. Okay, so this is why he's saying one type of knowledge is superior to the other. It's better to know the pattern than to know the individual particular instantiation. Morning knowledge, evening knowledge. Okay, now, just to make it more complicated for us, he now argues that there was essentially a Big Bang. What he says in the Latin is one punch. God punched the entire universe into existence at one time. Simul omnia facta sunt. God made all things together at once. In an ictus, a punch. So how does he get there? Well, he says, angels' intellects are so powerful that they do not need a series in order to know the various divine ideas. They can gaze on the entirety of the mind of God at once and see all the divine ideas. So all the mornings are really one act of morning knowledge. But in Genesis chapter 1, all the mornings are linked to an evening. So if all the mornings are one act of morning knowledge, then all the evenings are one act of evening knowledge. If the angels have evening knowledge of all the categories or days of creatures all at once, then all the creatures that God made must also have existed for the angels to know them. All right, so we're moving kind of quickly here, so let me just pause for a second. All right, we have to imagine the angels gazing up at the mind of God and seeing all the patterns of all possible creatures. Okay, that's morning knowledge. And he's saying that because angels don't have a brain, right? So the reason why you and I think in a series, if A then B, if B then C, A therefore C, is because we have a brain that slows us down, because we have a material processor that makes us clunky and slow in our thinking, okay? But if you are a pure immaterial intellect, you just have immediate insight, okay? So if we're looking at a set of ideas or facts, right, we look at one, then the other, then the other, then the other. But the angels are not like that, right? So the idea is they look at the mind of God and they see the whole pantheon of divine ideas, of everything that God could possibly create, all in one glance. The text of Genesis says morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening. They're always linked together. And each of those is a day, a day, a day, a day. So that means that the angels now are knowing the mulberry tree, the lion, the cheetah, the human being, the ocean, the plants, etc., all at once as well, because it corresponds to the mornings, right? Now, the point I just read is obviously you cannot have this evening knowledge if the actual concrete thing doesn't exist. Because remember, my example of evening knowledge was I look outside the window and I see that particular mulberry tree, right? So if we're now saying that the angels have evening knowledge of everything all at once, it means everything must exist at the physical, concrete level. So this is how he gets the conclusion that the most rational explanation of chapter 1 of Genesis is that God created the angels and all the objects of their evening knowledge, in other words, all the rest of creation, simultaneously. So the 6 days are not periods of time, but God created everything at once in one blow or strike of establishing the entire universe. And this is what chapter 1 is telling us, that the angels are created at the same time God creates everything else, and they see everything on both levels. They see it in the mind of God as a pattern, and then they see the actual things, all at the same time, one instant. Now, this leads us to his evolutionary theory. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay, which came first, the chicken or the egg, is almost like a direct quote from a passage of Augustine in the literal commentary on Genesis, where he's talking about birds, and he says, you know, if God created the birds, couldn't we say that God created the eggs? But if God created the eggs, couldn't we say that God created the liquid that's in the eggs, and all of that counts as creating the birds, right? Because to create an egg counts as creating the bird, and to create the liquid element that's in the egg counts as creating the egg, which counts as creating the bird, okay? So which came first, the chicken or the egg? God creating eggs would count as God creating birds, so when God creating the elements that make up the eggs also count as God creating eggs. This is what I just said. Yes, he says. What God actually created was matter having seed forms. In other words, having the potentiality to yield the species that actually emerged later. So he actually says, over the course of the ages, all of the species that we now see came to exist in their proper times. So he says God created the elements, and this counts as God creating everything that is composed of the elements. So I think this is mind-blowing. When I first sat down and read this book, I had no idea that Augustine was going to say any of this. I was just assigned to read it for an Augustine course, and I actually became very frustrated, but while I was reading, I was very excited, but then I was frustrated, like, why did no one ever tell me that this fascinating account exists and that it's so compatible with modern science? Now, obviously, his evolutionary theory is not pure Darwinianism, right? I mean, so he doesn't think that it's just random variations. He thinks that it's guided by the intelligent design of God. So he thinks that for life to emerge, God has to, like, provide efficient causality. And he also thinks that the human soul requires, like, the special intervention of God, which he has reasons for, but we could talk about in the question period if you want. Okay, so this is the end of the first really interesting theory, I think. And I just want to remind you how we got here. We got here through his biblical hermeneutic, which says that the Bible contains no errors and nothing extraneous. Through our knowledge of the physical world, through our knowledge of Platonic metaphysics, okay, the stuff about the ideas in the mind of God comes from Platonism and really Neoplatonism. And then knowledge of Stoic developmental theory. So this idea that the universe is evolved was actually posited first by the Stoics. So when Augustine says there are seed forms, that's actually an idea he got from the Stoics. They talk about spermatakoi logoi, the seminal principles or seminal forms, which are like basic structures in matter. Okay, now shifting gears completely, we're going to talk about something entirely different. So this is his theory of emotions. So he has what I call a development from Stoic psychological affective theory. And when I say development, what I mean is that he preserves their core principles, but he disagrees with them about some of the applications, and then he elaborates some new implications and applications. So there is a certain interest to Stoicism because it is analogous in some ways to contemporary psychology, and specifically the field of cognitive psychology. Stoicism is a school of thought that was influential in Greek and Roman culture from the 3rd century BC to the 5th century CE or AD. The Stoic theory of emotions was the first theory in the West to unambiguously assert that emotions are caused by beliefs about events rather than directly by events themselves. Events themselves do not make us upset. Our evaluative beliefs about what events stimuli mean for our happiness cause us to be upset. Okay, so another contrast would be with a purely biochemical attempt to explain emotions, right? Where you say it's just you sense something, like you see some act of violence, and then there's a physiological biochemical response that's automatic. That is not what the Stoics call an emotion. Okay, it's not that they deny that that can happen, but they just think that's an animal reaction, and it's not an emotion, properly speaking. An emotion, properly speaking, is based on your beliefs. The Stoics, therefore, are the first people to advocate cognitive therapy for emotional disorders. Therapy for sadness, hatred, or fear involves discovering and correcting one's false beliefs. In contemporary psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, has had documented success in treating emotional disorders such as depression and anxiety. So this is the analogous thing that I was pointing out. Now, I will say they're not identical, okay? So contemporary CBT is not exactly the same kind of thing as what the ancient Stoics were advocating, but the basic idea that revising your beliefs will lead you to a healthier emotional life, that is first articulated by the Stoics. And some of the earlier people in contemporary CBT theory, they do actually mention people like Seneca. So they do actually refer to the ancient Stoics. Okay, I'll give you an example. Someone might have anxiety at work because he has an inaccurate belief that he is incompetent. Given this false assumption, many ordinary events trigger the negative thought that he is about to fail, which results in anxiety. He also falsely believes that any type of failure will be unbearable. Cognitive therapy helps him to reject these two false beliefs by focusing on evidence and quote-unquote decatastrophizing, right? So decatastrophizing is when you say, look, I might fail at this presentation or at this meeting or at this party, but you know what? I can go on, right? It's not the end of the world. It's not the worst thing that can happen to me. And part of what you do is tell yourself what it is that would be worse than that failure, as we're about to see. Okay, so in order to really drill down into how to change our emotions, we need to understand why we have the emotions that we have. How does the mechanism work by which they are caused? So we have emotional reactions when we assent to a proposition which claims that some event in the past or the future is good or bad for us. Fear is rooted in the judgment that something bad will happen in the future. Grief arises from the judgment that something bad has occurred. Desire is caused by the judgment that something good is to be attained in the future. And joy is caused by the belief that something good has happened. Implicit in these beliefs about past and future goods and evils are the beliefs that I will be or I am happy or unhappy owing to the good or bad event. These four emotions are genera for the Stoics, and each has its own species emotions. For example, anger is a desire for revenge, so it's a kind of desire. Learning to control one's emotions thus requires that one correct false beliefs about good and bad, happiness and unhappiness, replacing them with true beliefs. Again, the contrast here would be something like, if you have a different theory of emotions, right, you might say, well, if you feel sad, you should run around the block, and then your sadness will go away, okay? And the Stoics are saying, actually, you might get like a momentary boost from endorphins, but that's not gonna cure like the root cause of your emotional sadness, right? Because to really cure that, you have to drill down into what is it that makes me sad? It's because I'm valuing something that I think I've lost, and then you have to evaluate whether those beliefs are true. Okay, so now we get to the very austere part. Usually when people think of the Stoics, they think of extreme austerity, and this is why. The Stoics held in Socratic fashion that only morally good qualities, virtues, are true goods, because only virtue is intrinsically productive of happiness. So cognitive therapy is the training of one's thoughts in the truth that all exterior things are not really good. That is, they are not intrinsically good for us as moral agents, and therefore they are not worth becoming attached to. To borrow a term from contemporary therapy, the Stoics think that many of us are prey to the cognitive distortion of dichotomous thinking, or black and white thinking is how people usually say this in ordinary language. It is not true that there are only two categories of things in the world, good and bad. Reality is much more varied, with a very large third class of things that are themselves indifferent to human happiness. This large class of indifferent things is in turn subdivided into things that are absolutely indifferent, such as the precise number of hairs on one's head, things preferable because they have value, for example, physical health, intellectual acumen, social relationships, and things that are dispreferred, which are the contraries of those, so poor health, a low intelligence quota, lack of friends, etc. So according to the Stoics, some of our emotions are good or can be good. So it's not a Dr. Spock model, right? A lot of times people think of that when they think of Stoicism. They think it's about apathy, having no emotions at all, and that is incorrect. They have this whole category called the eupatheiai, which are the good emotions. What makes them good is they're caused by accurate judgments that a good or evil has been or will be lost or gained by us. So the wise person feels precaution, which is a good fear. But what makes it be good is that it's based on a correct judgment about what's good and bad for us. So the only thing bad for us is doing something wrong, and the only thing good for us is being a good person. So I will only have fear of doing something wrong if I'm wise. I won't have fear of losing my job or getting sick or people not liking me or being poor, etc. There's rational desire at the prospect of doing a good act. So I feel all excited because I'm going to go visit people in the nursing home, which is a charitable thing to do. Okay, this is a good emotion for the Stoics. Joy at having completed a good act. I went to the nursing home, I helped those people, that was a good thing to do, now I have joy. Now the paradigm of the wise person, therefore, doesn't have any grief, right? Because the only thing worth being sad about would be doing something wrong. And if you're the ideal Stoic, you never do anything wrong, so you don't have any occasion to be sad, right? So there's no repentance. But let's assume that you're not perfectly wise, then the good sadness would be repentance for something you did that was wrong. So according to the Stoics, failure to train one's thoughts in the truth results in morally bad emotions caused by false beliefs that preferable indifferent things are good and dispreferred indifferent things are bad. In other words, it is incorrect to believe that the death of relatives, finding a spouse, being financially secure, living in a country that you can be proud of, and so on, are important for happiness. A person who has emotions about these things has craven fear. They have the kind of joy that is exhilaration about frivolous matters. And their grief is hysterical overreaction to things that are really irrelevant to happiness. These things are not productive of human happiness, and only fools assume that they are. Okay, so it's not Dr. Spock, but it is very austere, as I said. The only thing that matters is being a good person or being a bad person. Everything else, you're not supposed to be emotionally upset about. It doesn't mean you don't pursue it, right? So you will try, if you have the choice, you will try to be healthy rather than sick because it's preferred. It has value. And you will try to avoid being sick because that's dispreferred. So you will take actions. You will eat vitamin C and you will get enough sleep, etc. But if you get sick, you won't grieve that you're sick, okay? Because you're detached from the outcome. You're not emotionally invested in it. Okay, so now let's talk briefly about what Augustine does with this. He agrees with the Stoics that the causes of emotions are judgments by the mind. It's a cognitive model. He agrees with them that emotions can be classified as morally good and morally bad based on the truth or falsity of the belief that causes the emotion. He disagrees with the Stoics that moral goods are the only goods. He tells us plainly that the Stoics' claim that moral virtue is the only good is unacceptable to him. He distinguishes the moral virtues from other things by the terms eternal and temporal, eternal goods and temporal goods. The eternal goods are the virtues. They are called eternal primarily because they can be possessed endlessly by the soul. They are up to us or under our control. We can only lose them through choice. Temporal goods, on the other hand, are what the Stoics call preferable indifferent things. The temporal goods are inferior because they are ontologically inferior. They are corruptible. They are outside of our control. So now we have a situation where getting a job is good, but it's a lesser good than being a good person. Right? Finding a spouse is good, but it's lesser good than being a just person, etc. Now he gives us this revised account of happiness, because according to the Stoics, all you need for happiness is to be a morally good person, and that's it, and that's the end of the story. Nothing more to say. But now Augustine has this more complicated schema. There's a happy life, the happier life, and the happiest life. So some temporal goods are necessary for attaining moral virtues. In other words, you would need moral teachers. You would need to not be neglected and abused by your parents, probably, right? Like you would need good exemplars. There's probably like a modicum of food you need, because if you're actually starving, you might lose your moral responsibility, right? Because you'll just be so starving that you're willing to steal or something. I mean, we can debate whether that's actually wrong or whether it's a Jean Valjean, Robin Hood situation, which is a fun thing to debate. But I'm just trying to throw examples out, right? Like if you torture a person, maybe that's a better example, right? You torture a person physically, there's probably a certain threshold at which they're no longer responsible for telling a lie, right? Because they're just in so much pain, right? So if you don't have this basic modicum of temporal goods, you can't attain moral virtue, right? Apart from those, which are very few, Augustine thinks, temporal goods are not necessary for happiness, okay? Because the happy life is produced by having secure moral virtues. That's the definition of happy life. This includes any temporal goods necessary for attaining virtue. All right, so note that the word happy here means doing one's proper function, which is reasoning well. Okay, if you go back to ancient philosophy, you see in Plato and Aristotle, they talk about what is the specific function of a human being, and the answer is reason. Okay, and then the whole thing is about trying to do your proper human function well, right? And that's eudaimonia, or happiness, okay? So that's one definition of happiness you find in ancient philosophy, and that's the one that he's using here. Now, the complicated thing is, in ancient philosophy, there's another definition of happiness, which is total satisfaction. And you also see this in both Plato and Aristotle, just in different parts of their texts. So Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics, happiness is a state in which there's no further end that you desire, right? You're no longer acting for the sake of an end, but you're at the end. And Plato in the Symposium, right, he talks about this state of like being locked into contemplation of the good and the beautiful, and that's kind of the highest you can go as a human being. There's nothing left for you to love or desire after that, okay? So what Augustine does is bring those two different definitions of happiness together, but distinguish them. One is happiness, one is happier. Happier, okay? So satisfaction, when we start talking about feeling satisfied or being totally satisfied, then we're talking about the state of happier and happiest life, okay? So the happier and the happiest life are having secure moral virtue, that's happiness, plus additional temporal goods as adornments, states of satisfaction. Now comes his view of history, the bad news and the good news. In this life, we cannot be happy because moral virtue is not entirely secure, even if we attain it. So he thinks, we have this internal kind of instability to us because we're made from nothing and because we're damaged as a result of original sin. And so because of these two factors, we can always lapse out of moral virtue at any time. We can't be completely predictable and say, I'm now virtuous, I will remain virtuous for the rest of my life. So the only place you can be happy is in heaven, in the afterlife. But in fact, heaven is a state of maximal happiness, the happiest life. This means the happier life is an empty set, really, for Augustine. It's a conceptual category, but there's nobody in it. Okay, so just briefly, how Augustine revises then the theory of emotions, given this revision of ontology and the revision of his account, the Stoic account of happiness. Because he thinks that the Stoics' preferred indifference are actually real goods, and their dispreferred indifference really are bad, and emotions are about good and bad things, he thinks that a wise person has emotions about a wider range of things than the Stoics do, about temporal goods as well as about virtues. If an emotion is about a temporal good, one judges correctly that a good necessary for maximal happiness is at stake, but at the same time accepts that maximal happiness is not possible in this life. There's also degrees of caring about things that we should, reflect in our emotions. So we should feel more upset or glad the greater the magnitude of the temporal good, as well as whether it's about an eternal good or a temporal good. So getting a job versus getting an A, getting a job is a greater temporal good than getting an A, but they're both goods, but they're both lesser goods compared to being a good person. So if on the same day I commit a small wrongdoing, but I win the lottery, which one should I be more emotionally invested in? The small wrongdoing, right? So I should be more upset that I did something wrong than I am joyful about the fact of having won the lottery. Okay, so it's still very austere. And of course, as I just said, I have to have my evaluation correct within the category of temporal goods as well. Okay, great. So I think this is better than the Stoic theory. So the problem with the Stoic theory is they basically have to tie themselves into knots, trying to defend the claim that sickness, physical injuries, betrayal by friends, poverty, loneliness, lack of education, and so on are not actually relevant to our well-being. And this is obviously empirically wrong, I would say. Okay, just look at human nature. Even according to the Stoic theory of human nature, it's wrong. So they're basically incoherent in this part of their philosophy. Because you can see they say these things have value for us, but then they don't want to say that they contribute anything to our life. So how are those compatible? Right? If you try to make people be completely inured to these types of losses, it usually backfires, right? Creates bitterness, a type of habitual anger rather than emotional health. So the point of the theory is to try to make you emotionally healthy, but if you tell people like, oh, you just shouldn't care that your mom just died, or it doesn't matter that your child died, which is what the Stoics will say. It doesn't matter for your happiness, okay? Then it doesn't actually make people emotionally healthier. It just makes them kind of angry and bitter, etc. Okay, so I think that Augustine's view is better because the way that he critiques and revises the Stoic view avoids that problem. But it's still very austere, as I said. So here's just a few of Augustine's cognitive therapies. They're borrowed from the Stoics, but kind of put into this new worldview that he synthesizes, creates. Pre-rehearsal of future events. This is originally a Stoic cognitive therapy. You see this in Epictetus and Seneca, if you read them. I need to foresee what might happen so that I will not be shocked and overreact if it does happen. So they say, for example, in the morning you should go through everything you need to do today and foresee all of the inconvenient things that might happen to you. Okay, when I go into town, people will jostle me in the streets. When I go to the baths, they will splash in my face. When I go to the gym, there will be a line to get in, whatever. And then you're supposed to decatastrophize and tell yourself, well, it's really not so bad. If I wake up tomorrow, my baby has died in the crib because of SIDS. Right? It's not going to impact my happiness. It's basically in the Stoics, the only thing they talk about is thinking about the negative things, right? The bad things that could happen, to try to convince yourself that when they happen, they're not actually bad for you. It's not so bad. So Augustine is similar, right? So he does advocate thinking ahead to foresee possible disappointments. So here's a quote from one of his sermons that he gave in the cathedral at Hippo. He says, "You love a wife, not married yet, but going to be married. And perhaps you love her who is going to be married, but you will hate her once you're married. How so? Because when you have married her, you find she is not really like what your imagination had pictured her to be before. Think about how you are going to leave here. You are born, you will die. It will come, even if you don't want it to. So why be afraid of what's going to happen, even if you don't want it to? The second quote is almost straight out of Seneca, because Seneca's constantly saying, think about the fact that you're going to die, right? And the Western notion of memento mori, if you go to a monastery, a lot of times you'll see that written, they'll have a skull, and they'll say, memento mori, remember you're going to die. This is Seneca's advocation of pre-rehearsal. That's what the Stoics advocate. Always think about the bad things that could happen and tell yourself it's not so bad. Don't over-idealize situations like getting married, because once you're married, you're going to suffer. The woman's going to annoy you, right? Nothing is perfect the way you imagine it to be. Augustine is a little more upbeat, though, okay, because he also advocates pre-rehearsing future good things and not just the bad things. So he advocates pre-rehearsing heaven. Think about heaven, right? Think about the fact that in heaven, all the temporal goods will be justly distributed and there will be no more suffering. So there is an analogy for this in contemporary cognitive therapy where they tell you to imagine or visualize in your mind the desired outcome of your action. What Augustine recommends is calling to mind that the resurrection came out of the crucifixion. Okay, so again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, the notion that God can bring good things out of evil things, right? And so whatever suffering or evil situation we think we're in, we should think about how it can be turned to advantage, and good things will eventually come in heaven, if not in this life. Okay, final thing I want to say is quickly about grace and free choice. So the basic problem that Augustine inherits or notices in ancient philosophy is that there is a relationship between habits and moral perception. So the problem is, it really is good for us to be morally virtuous, right? To be a just person, to be a moderate person, to be a generous person. This is actually good for us. It's good for our soul, it's human thriving, it's human flourishing. But if we have bad habits, we will not see it as good for us. We will see it as onerous, distasteful, things that we don't want to do. And then, of course, there's different degrees of habituation. You could be addicted to drinking, let's say, and then if I propose to you that you stop drinking or smoking or whatever, then it's going to be almost impossible for you if you're addicted. If you've only just slightly gotten into the habit of drinking or smoking, it's easier for you to see that maybe it's not good for you to do that, okay? So now we have this problem. We have free choice, okay? That's part of our setup as humans. But we effectively lose the power to give assent or deny assent based on our habits, given what our habits are, okay? In theory, you can tell the alcoholic, look, you really don't need alcohol. I'm going to give you a whole chart showing you all the bad effects of being an alcoholic, okay? But they're always going to use their free choice to choose the drink when it comes down to the moment, because the way they see it is, I can't be happy without these drinks, okay, because of their habit. Now, the interesting thing is, original sin, according to Augustine, is a set of very, very deeply ingrained bad habits that we inherit through the generations. And this is why it's impossible for us just to break out of it on our own. So we think of original sin as like a purely theological concept. He thinks of it as just an instance of this standard ancient problem of how do you break out of bad habits, right? Because, when you read Aristotle or Plato, they both talk so much about the importance of habit formation, right? We have to start with children. We have to give them good habits when they're 4. Otherwise, by the time they're 10, it will be too late, right? This is what Plato says in the Republic, right? If you want to have this beautiful city that I'm talking about, you have to start only with people under the age of 10. Take everybody over the age of 10 out of the city because it's too late for them. They're spoiled, okay? So this is something the ancients recognized, and Augustine thinks that this is basically what we mean when we say we're fallen, is that we inherit these attitudes and bad habits that are very deeply ingrained. Now, how we inherit those, what's the mechanism, that's something we could talk about in the question period. Okay, so this is why he thinks we can't just rehabituate ourselves, right? If you read Plato and Aristotle, again, the solution is always just try to rehabituate yourself, form new habits, okay? But Augustine thinks, okay, there's an innate habit that's universal, so this means all parenting and all governing is dysfunctional. Indeed, it's morally corrupt and corrupting. So there's really no way for children to be trained entirely properly. Even if that were possible, the child has a strong inherited habit. So he will fail to assimilate the reasons why he should do the right kinds of deeds. The habituation would have failed of its purpose as moral rehabituation. I'll explain what I mean by that on the next slide. And then lastly, adults who learn that their parenting and inclinations are faulty will see virtues as in principle and in theory good, but not good for their own happiness, right? So you can think like, yeah, in principle, it would be great to be in good physical condition and work out every day. But I don't see it as something that's going to make me happy to go work out. So I get the theory, but practically I'm not going to do it, right? I just want to explain what I mean here about the external versus the internal. Even if we had perfect parenting and perfect schooling, et cetera, those are external constraints, right? They work through fear of punishment and reward incentives. So the problem is if you have an internal problem already of a bad habit, there's really no guarantee that the external conditioning is going to change you on the inside. And in order to be morally reformed, you have to be doing something because it's the right thing to do, not just because someone's going to punish you if you don't do it, or because you're going to get a reward, right? So in Aristotle's language, you have to be acting for the sake of the kalan, or for the sake of what is noble. And that's the tricky part. Okay, so Augustine's solution to this is that there is divinely given motivation. God is necessary to breathe a new perception into our mind. So as he says, if those things delight us, which serve our advancement towards God, that is inspired and bestowed by the grace of God. We need to change our minds, our attitude, our perceptions, but we actually cannot change those ourselves, okay? So we need an external supernatural force to counteract the effects, natural inertia of habituation and cause us to see things in a different way, to see that it's actually good for us to be virtuous. Now, he thinks also that we are so fallen that God has to give us not only this first suggestion or perception, but he also has to give us the decision. This is what you see in Confessions Book 8, okay, where the Tolle Lege scene, we could talk about more in detail in the question period. But basically, he describes seeing continence as attractive, seeing the virtue of chastity as attractive, but then not being able to consent to change his way of life, right? He's still too weak. And so then there's a second grace that happens in paragraph 27. So now we have this problem, which I'm only going to allude to briefly because I promised I would. If God is giving people not only the suggestion or the perception of moral conversion, but also the decision, then how are we free? Is Augustine saying that human beings are merely puppets when they're converted by God to a good life? And what I want you to notice about the confession scene in Book 8 is that there's an intermediate step. So he starts off, okay, by saying, now, my God, I will now tell the story of how you freed me from the bonds of habit, okay, sexual habit, which had changed me down. And then he says, Pontitianus told him this story, and while he heard the story, he saw continence as attractive. But then he says, but I still couldn't decide. I ran out in the garden, and I invoked God, and I said, how much longer are you going to leave me in this state of indecision and weakness and inability to make a decision. So that is a voluntary act, the act of invocation. And then in response, he says that he hears the child singing Tolle Lege, which doesn't really mean take and read, it means take and pick. It was a chant that the children were singing when they were helping with the harvest. But if you read carefully what Augustine says, he says, which I interpreted as a divine sign that I should pick up the book and read it. Because lege could mean pick in Latin, but it could also mean read. So he's saying he heard these children singing this song about helping with the harvest, and he took it to mean he should read the Bible. And then in reading the Bible, he says, by the end of reading that line in Paul, I had made my decision. The decision was made. I had no more doubt. Okay, so it's presented as God enabled him to make the decision in the reading of it. I am supplementing with things Augustine says in other books. If you're wondering, how did she get all of this out of these 2 paragraphs of Confessions? I read that and I didn't see all that there. But he says this stuff all over his corpus because of the Pelagian debate. Okay. All right, so this second step of invocation is the way that fallen humans exercise their freedom in their own conversion. That's the model that we get in the confession. So God initiates it. This is what is called prevenient grace in theology. That term comes from Augustine, prevenire, praevenire. God comes first with the grace of changing our perception. And then we have to invoke God for additional aid. And then God gives us grace of consent, being able to actually decide. So it's what I call the dialogue model of grace. It's initiated by God, but we have to participate by asking God for more grace. I think we're out of time. So I do have this quote here, but I can just leave it up on the screen. And if you want to read it during the question period, feel free. But maybe I should close and we should move on to questions if people have any questions. Okay?
Thank you, Professor Byers. We do have time for some questions now. And we have a microphone, so if you could please indicate by raising your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'll bring the microphone over to you, and please try to keep your question concise as well. Thank you. While folks are thinking, oh, a question over here, very good.
Yes.
Just a moment, I'll bring the microphone.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was wonderful. A question about prefer indifferent goods. I wonder how this motivational theory works, because there is no rational desire towards these indifferent goods. So how I act without rational desire, how I conceive these goods to generate them, to produce them in my life, though...
You mean for the Stoics, right?
Correct.
Yes.
And for Augustine as well, right?
Well, for Augustine, I can have rational desire for a temporal good. It just has to be calibrated to the actual value of the good thing, right? Because remember, he says these things actually are goods, they're just lesser goods. So that's, for Augustine, it's not a problem to have actual desire for those things. For the Stoics, the way that they try to explain it is they have a separate thing which they call impulse to act. So if I see with my mind that this thing has value, so let's say the thing is getting a job. Okay, I see why it is valuable to have a job, because I can support myself and I can live the virtue of generosity by giving people, donations and whatever. I can do all kinds of, moral things with the money as an instrument, right? And with my colleagues at work, I can do morally good things as well. That will cause in me an impulse to get a job, according to the Stoics, but that's not the same as an emotion of wanting a job, according to the Stoics. Because the emotion of wanting the job is like this feeling of craving, which is the desire. And that's what they're saying we shouldn't have, because we shouldn't be emotionally invested. We should just actually pursue them because we see it's a rational thing to do. Yeah, that's the Stoics. So very tricky. But this is what they want to say, that it's a desire to do the action, but not a desire for the thing. Okay? Yeah, you're welcome. Yes?
You led us to this question, so I'm just parroting it back because it interests me.
Sure.
How do we inherit bad habits from previous generations?
Okay, great. So a bit speculative on Augustine's part, all right, but he thinks the soul is immaterial, all right, and so when we're talking about like moral attitudes, these are things of the soul. These are not obviously features of our body, right? So you can't inherit through your bodily DNA. We would say, he doesn't know about DNA, right? But he would say something like blood, right? Or we can't inherit from our parents' blood these bad moral attitudes. Okay, so it has to be somehow we inherit like part of their soul? What does that look like? Okay, so the theory that he has from Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonic philosopher who synthesizes Aristotle and Plato together, is that the human soul is a substance. Okay, so it's a thing that exists in its own right, it's immaterial, but it has an unchanging component, and then it has like a changeable component to it. So the unchanging component of the soul is the mind. The changeable component of the soul are your attitudes, your habits, those things that come and go, right? All the events in your mental life and moral life. So he thinks that when, like in the act of reproduction, God directly infuses a mind, okay? The form of the soul, okay? And that you inherit from your parents' souls this changeable aspect of the soul that's already kind of deformed. So your soul actually has sort of like two components, okay? Now, it's not a perfect theory, okay? Because how are you going to explain how the immaterial soul stuff in your parent's soul, like, physically moves into being part of your soul, but of course that's not really the right way to put it because it's not physical to begin with, it's immaterial, right? On the other hand, is there a better theory of how to explain moral corruption passing from generation to generation? Because as we said in the beginning, it's not that your cells are passing on moral qualities, right? I mean, you can't say like this chromosome from my dad is the reason why I'm lustful or something, right? This is a moral quality. So it's just kind of mysterious, okay? And that's what Augustine tries to do as speculation towards kind of the end of his life. But it's a question he wonders about through his whole life. And so if you look like at an earlier book, like On Free Choice, he'll say like, well, there's various theories about how the soul gets into the body and whether the soul pre-exists the body, where it came from. Tertullian, who's a North African earlier than Augustine, was a materialist, so he thought the soul was just material. So for him, it's very easy to explain, because for Tertullian, you just get this physical stuff from your parents, and that's your soul. And it has these moral qualities. But of course, the problem with that is matter doesn't have moral qualities, really, right? So, and also there's a lot of arguments to show that the soul is not material, right? The soul wouldn't be able to do the things it does if it were material. So Augustine rejects the materialism, but he wants to retain that notion of like plasticity of the soul that we could somehow inherit. I mean, I don't think anybody has really a great theory about how original sin is transmitted, right? Because of this central problem that we know that we get genetic material from our parents, which is material, but moral qualities do not attach to matter, right? And it's a moral deficiency that we're talking about. So Augustine's theory is kind of ingenious in a way, and it comes, as I said, from the synthesis of Plato and Aristotle that Plotinus did. So he was a 3rd century philosopher, pagan, but they all use pagan philosophy. So that's not, you don't need to use like specifically revelation for things like what is the soul, because all the arguments that we have a soul and what the soul is come from ancient philosophy and Catholicism. So.
Thank you, Professor Byers.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I'm struck by the deeper ideas in the Confessions and the ancient philosophies, and I wondered about Augustine's expositions on the Psalms.
Yeah.
And if you, so the two-part question is, when was Augustine interpreting the Psalms, and was this contemporaneous to all this other work, and do you see one informing the other?
Oh, yes, definitely. So this quotation is from his commentary on the Psalms. The commentaries on the Psalms, you could ask your learned colleague here in the front row, because she's writing her senior thesis on it, on Augustine's commentaries on the Psalms. He wrote it over a number of years, but they're actually sermons that he gave like at evening prayer on Sundays. So they were taken down by a stenographer. So depending on which time period in like the 10 or 15 years that these were composed, or 20 years, I don't recall off the top of my head, he will be addressing different topics. So if you want to see things about grace, for example, you need to look after like 400 or later, because that's when he's arguing with Pelagius about God being the initiator of grace and humans needing grace to get salvation. And so then you can kind of, the problem is that, there's 150 Psalms, and then some of them he wrote multiple sermons, gave multiple sermons on that one Psalm. So we don't have a date of when he wrote each one of these things, but you can kind of tell by the topic, right? Because if you can read it and say like, this quotation is about rain coming down from the sky, and then he makes it be about grace, right? And by interpreting it allegorically. So from that, like, oh, this is during the anti-Pelagian phase of his writing. But I highly recommend, everyone to read his commentary on the Psalms. They're fantastic. It's amazing. I would say don't read the most recent translation by Boulding, because it's not literal enough. I would read the Victorian one, which is free online in PDFs. John Henry Newman's, set of friends in the Oxford movement, they translated them. And that's a closer translation to the original Latin. Yes, but they're very, very beautiful. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Well, on the note of that encouragement to turn to Augustine on the Psalms, please join me in thanking Professor Byers.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Professor Byers, and thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Father Zach Swantek, chaplain at the Aquinas Institute, and I just wanted to note that, as you may be aware, that much of our programming is for our students, especially for our Bible studies, where we have 40 students leading Bible studies in the dorms throughout the campus. Our seminars that we offer on various topics from the Catholic intellectual tradition, our discipleship formation in our Into the Deep program, and also our service. But also there are many things that are open to the public, like this, our guest lectures, and next month on November 22nd, on the feast of St. Cecilia, patron saint of music, we're happy to welcome Cardinal Sarah to come here to speak on his new book on sacred music. So he'll be doing that on Saturday, the 22nd at 2 p.m., and then on Sunday he'll celebrate our 4:30 p.m. Mass for us. And then also that you're always welcome to any of our liturgical events and Mass, and just noting that this Saturday, November 1st, is All Saints' Day, and we'll have Mass at 9 a.m. in the University Chapel, and then Sunday is All Souls' Day, and at our 4:30 and our 10 p.m. Mass, we'll be offering Mass for all the faithful departed and all souls, and if you're on our mailing list, you can submit people that you would like us to pray for, not only on All Souls' Day, but throughout the month of November. We'll continue to pray for them and offer our Masses for them. Thank you for coming.